It all started with a bang. Not a metaphorical one, an actual bang, loud enough to shake the already fragile walls of the house I had just bought. As I stood there, covered in dust, staring at the collapsed section of the ceiling that had just given up on life, I couldn't help but wonder if I had just made the worst decision of my existence. $90,000. That's what I had paid for this abandoned wreck, a house so neglected that even raccoons seemed to have moved out due to poor living conditions. The realtor had called it a hidden gem, but standing in the middle of what looked like the set of a post-apocalyptic movie, I had a sinking feeling that the only thing hidden here was my common sense. The air smelled like mold, regret, and something disturbingly close to a dead animal. The floors creaked in a way that suggested they were planning a mutiny, and the wallpaper was peeling off as if even it didn't want to be part of this disaster. But despite all that, I had a vision. I could see past the decay, past the questionable stains, past the ominous sounds coming from the walls. I was determined to restore this house into something beautiful. What I didn't know was that my biggest problem wouldn't be the house. It would be the neighbor from hell. I first met him on day 2, when I was hauling out debris from what was supposed to be the living room but looked more like an archaeological site. He emerged from his perfectly manicured yard like a villain stepping onto the scene of a movie. He was tall, gaunt, and carried the unmistakable expression of a man who had never known joy. His face had that permanent scowl, like he was personally offended by the concept of happiness. Without even a hello, he pointed at my house, or rather, at the disaster I was trying to turn into a house, and scoffed. "You really paid money for that thing?" His voice dripped with disbelief and something else, disdain. I forced a smile, trying to keep things civil. "Yep, planning to fix it up." He crossed his arms and let out a dry chuckle. "Good luck with that. This neighborhood has standards." I should have ignored him. I should have just nodded and gone back to my work. But something about the way he said it, the sheer arrogance in his tone, made me pause. "Standards?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "You mean like that lovely collection of garden gnomes you have?" I gestured toward the absurdly large family of gnomes lining his walkway. He stiffened, clearly unamused. "Those are antiques." I bit back a laugh. This man was worried about neighborhood aesthetics while his yard looked like a gnome cult gathering. I quickly realized that he wasn't just unpleasant, he was obsessed. Over the next few weeks, I caught him lurking around, watching my every move like some kind of nosy watchdog. The moment I started painting the exterior, he lost it. I had chosen a modern, fresh shade, something to breathe life into the place. Apparently, that was a crime in his book. One morning, I stepped outside to find him standing at the edge of my property, arms crossed, shaking his head at the paint cans. "You can't do that," he announced, as if he were the ultimate authority on all things real estate. "It clashes with the historic feel of the neighborhood." I looked around. The neighborhood consisted of a mix of homes, most of which had clearly undergone some updates over the years. I gestured at the bright pink house down the street. "So that's okay, but my neutral color isn't?" He pursed his lips. "That house was like that when they moved in. You're changing things." It took every ounce of self-restraint not to throw a paintbrush at him. Instead, I took a deep breath and smiled. "Well, I guess you'll just have to close your eyes when you walk by." That was the beginning of the war. From then on, it was like living in a sitcom where the antagonist was a retired military general with too much free time. Every single thing I did was met with passive-aggressive resistance. He called the city to complain about my construction noise, at 2 in the afternoon. He accused my workers of ruining the peace, while simultaneously blasting classical music at ungodly volumes from his backyard. He even tried to tell the garbage collection service that I was illegally dumping, which resulted in a very awkward conversation with a very confused sanitation worker. But nothing compared to the day I found an official-looking document taped to my front door. At first, my heart sank, thinking I had actually done something wrong. Then I read it. It was a notice stating that I was being sued for decreasing property values and destroying neighborhood integrity. I stared at the paper in disbelief. I knew he was petty, but this was next-level ridiculous. My renovations were increasing the property value, if anything. The house had been a crumbling disaster before I got here. And neighborhood integrity? What did that even mean? Was he under the impression that my painting, plumbing, and repairing somehow threatened the moral fiber of the community? I looked across the street at a house that had at least 3 broken-down cars in the yard and a flamingo wearing a cowboy hat. Yes, the integrity of this neighborhood was truly at risk. But the kicker? At the bottom of the document, in small print, was a note. An offer. He was willing to drop the lawsuit if I sold him the house, at the exact price I had bought it for. That's when it all clicked. This wasn't about the neighborhood. This wasn't about paint colors or noise. He had wanted this house. He had probably been waiting for the price to drop further, assuming it would sit abandoned for years. And now, instead of getting it dirt cheap, he was watching me turn it into something valuable, something he couldn't have. I should have been furious, and I was. But more than that, I was entertained. The audacity, the sheer pettiness, was almost impressive. He really thought he could scare me into handing over my investment just because he threw a tantrum? I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to make sure he regretted ever picking this battle. I took the document, walked over to his house, and knocked. When he opened the door, I gave him the brightest, most irritatingly cheerful smile I could muster. "Thanks for the paperwork," I said. "I'll have my lawyer look over it. Oh, and by the way, I hope you like the color green, because I just ordered a brand new lawn setup. Artificial turf. Should clash nicely with your antiques." His face turned red. His nostrils flared. If steam could physically shoot out of ears, I would have been drenched. But before he could open his mouth to unleash whatever rant he was preparing, I turned on my heel and walked away, whistling. Let the games begin. The lawsuit was laughable, but I knew better than to ignore it. My neighbor clearly thought he had me backed into a corner, that I would panic and cave under the pressure, but he had severely underestimated just how stubborn I could be. Instead of running to him with my tail between my legs, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called a lawyer. A friend of mine from college had gone into real estate law, and after a brief conversation filled with a mixture of laughter and disbelief, he assured me that my neighbor's so-called legal document was nothing more than an empty threat dressed up in fancy words. It held no real weight, no legal foundation, and was about as threatening as a strongly worded letter from an angry HOA president who had watched too many courtroom dramas. But knowing that and proving it were two different things, and if my neighbor wanted a fight, he was going to get one. I wasn't just going to defend myself. I was going to make this entire process as painful for him as possible. With my lawyer's guidance, I drafted an official response, complete with my own set of concerns about his harassment, noise complaints, and baseless accusations. I made sure it was just formal enough to sound intimidating, while still carrying that underlying tone of, "I know exactly what game you're playing." The moment I taped it to his door, mirroring the exact way he had delivered his threat to me, I felt a surge of satisfaction unlike anything I had experienced before. I didn't even need to see his reaction to know it had hit its mark. The very next morning, the music from his backyard was louder than ever, a symphony of petty defiance blaring through the neighborhood. But that was fine. If he wanted to play dirty, I had an entire arsenal of tactics he wasn't prepared for. My first move was simple, yet effective. I doubled down on the renovations. Instead of taking things slow, I hired more workers, brought in heavy machinery, and made sure there was constant, unavoidable noise from dawn till dusk. Every hammer strike, every drill, every truck unloading supplies, it was all carefully orchestrated to push him further toward the edge. And it worked beautifully. The first few days, he did his best to ignore it, pretending to be unaffected, but by the end of the week, he had completely unraveled. I caught him standing at his window, staring daggers at the construction crew, his frustration so palpable that even the workers started making a game out of it, placing bets on how long it would take before he cracked. Then came the petty sabotage attempts. Mysterious complaints started rolling in, fabricated noise violations, alleged permit issues, even an absurd claim that my foundation work was causing his property to sink. City officials visited multiple times, each time leaving more confused than the last when they found nothing out of order. One of the inspectors, an older man with a weary expression, pulled me aside after his third visit and sighed. "Listen, I shouldn't be saying this, but between you and me, this guy has been filing complaints for years. You're not the first person he's tried to run off. He just likes control." That information only fueled my determination. He had probably bullied plenty of people into submission before, but I wasn't about to be one of them. The tipping point came when I installed security cameras. Not only did I set up cameras around my property, but I made sure one was directly facing his house, a silent reminder that I was documenting everything. The first time he saw them, he actually came storming over, livid. "This is an invasion of privacy," he shouted, gesturing wildly at the cameras. I smiled, arms crossed. "Oh? So you have a problem with someone watching your every move? That's funny. I seem to recall you doing a lot of that to me." His face twitched, a mix of rage and realization washing over him as he realized that I wasn't just fighting back, I was winning. But the real masterpiece of my revenge came when I finally flipped the script on him. Since he was so concerned about the historic integrity of the neighborhood, I decided to do a little digging. With the help of a few contacts in real estate and city planning, I unearthed an interesting piece of information. His own house, the one he was so fiercely protecting, had multiple code violations. Outdated plumbing, an illegal extension he had built years ago without permits, even an old dispute over property lines that had never been fully resolved. It was a goldmine of leverage. I didn't confront him directly. That would have been too easy. Instead, I let the city do the work for me. A few anonymous reports, a strategically timed visit from the zoning board, and suddenly, my neighbor was the one under scrutiny. Watching him scramble to fix things, dealing with fines and inspections, was nothing short of poetic justice. He tried to pretend it wasn't a big deal, but the stress was obvious. His precious, perfect home was now the subject of city intervention, and for the first time since this battle had begun, he was the one feeling the pressure. The final blow came when I put up the "for sale" sign. Not for my house, his. The very house he had fought so hard to protect, the one he had tried to manipulate me into selling, was now on the market. He hadn't even told the neighbors yet, but I had sources, and the moment I confirmed it, I made sure word spread fast. His pride had finally broken under the weight of his own pettiness. I watched from my newly renovated front porch as he packed up his things, moving away in quiet defeat. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't even look in my direction. And that was fine by me. As his car disappeared down the street, I leaned back, taking in the view of my completed project. The house that had once been a wreck was now a beautiful, modern home, standing as a testament to perseverance, patience, and a little bit of well-placed revenge. The gnome collection was gone, the ridiculous complaints were over, and for the first time since I had moved in, the neighborhood felt peaceful. I had won, and it was worth every second of the fight. It should have been over. The house was complete, the renovations were flawless, and my neighbor had finally packed up and left after his humiliating defeat. I had expected a quiet victory, a chance to finally enjoy my hard work without interference. But life, as I was quickly learning, had a way of throwing in one last unexpected twist just when you thought the storm had passed. It started with a letter. Not a lawsuit this time, not another fabricated complaint, but a handwritten note delivered to my mailbox, unsigned, with a single sentence written in bold, aggressive strokes. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." At first, I laughed. It was pathetic, really, like something out of a bad thriller novel. My old neighbor, clearly unable to accept his loss, was still trying to rattle me from a distance. I tossed the letter aside, assuming it was nothing more than an empty threat, the final whimper of a man who had lost his battle and his pride. But then, little things started happening. Subtle at first. Small inconveniences that could have been coincidences, but added up to something far more sinister. One morning, I walked outside to find my brand new mailbox dented in as if someone had taken a bat to it. A week later, my security cameras mysteriously stopped working, the wires slashed in a clean, deliberate cut. Then came the noises. Late at night, strange rattling near the back of the house, footsteps crunching on gravel where no one should have been walking. I told myself it was paranoia, that I was letting his nonsense get to me, but deep down, I knew better. He was still here. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. I did what any rational person would do. I called the police. They came out, took a report, nodded sympathetically, and assured me they would patrol the area more often. But without concrete evidence, there wasn't much they could do. And besides, my neighbor wasn't stupid. He wasn't going to do anything that could get him caught. He was playing a game, trying to make me second-guess myself, trying to make me feel unsafe in my own home. But if he thought he could scare me out, he had clearly forgotten who he was dealing with. I had spent months fighting him, outmaneuvering him at every turn. If he wanted another round, I was more than happy to play. I started by reinforcing my security system. New cameras, motion sensor lights, and an alarm system that could wake the dead if someone so much as breathed too close to my property. Then, I decided to do a little digging of my own. If my neighbor was still lurking around, he had to be staying somewhere nearby. I reached out to a few contacts, did some quiet asking around, and eventually, I found what I was looking for. He hadn't moved far. In fact, he hadn't moved at all. The house he had sold had never actually been finalized. He was still the owner, still hanging on, lurking in the shadows like some kind of bitter ghost refusing to leave. That meant one thing. He was coming back. He wasn't done. I didn't wait for him to make the next move. Instead, I set a trap. With the help of a few strategically placed hidden cameras and a bit of patience, I finally caught him in the act. 3 nights in a row, I recorded him sneaking onto my property, skulking around like a deranged raccoon, checking my doors, peering into my windows. It was chilling, but also infuriating. He was so desperate to regain control, so obsessed with the idea of winning, that he had reduced himself to trespassing in the dead of night like a common criminal. And that was all I needed. I sent the footage straight to the police, and this time, they had no choice but to act. They picked him up the very next night, catching him in the middle of yet another late-night reconnaissance mission. I didn't even have to be there to see it. I watched the entire thing unfold through my camera feed, sipping a cup of coffee as my former nightmare of a neighbor was finally dragged off in handcuffs. But the real satisfaction came the next morning when I received a call from my lawyer. Apparently, my neighbor's little obsession with my property had finally caught up with him. Between the bogus lawsuit, the harassment, and now the criminal trespassing charges, his legal troubles were piling up fast. He was facing fines, a potential restraining order, and the possibility of jail time if he kept pushing his luck. And the best part? Because he had never finalized the sale of his house, he was now legally stuck with it. Unable to afford both legal fees and the costs of maintaining a property he no longer wanted, he had no choice but to put it back on the market. This time, for real. And guess who put in the first offer? I could have let it go. I could have walked away, happy to never deal with him again. But after everything he had put me through, I wanted to make sure he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he had lost. So I bought his house. The moment the deal was finalized, I walked straight up to his front door, the very door he had once slammed in my face, and left a note of my own, taped right where he used to leave his little legal threats. It was short, simple, and to the point. Looks like I won after all. He was gone within the week. No farewell, no last-minute tricks, just a bitter old man who had finally realized he was outmatched. As for me, I had just doubled my investment. I didn't even keep the house. I flipped it within months, turning an even bigger profit than I had expected. And with the money I made, I finished the final touches on my own home, the house that had started as a crumbling disaster and was now the crown jewel of the neighborhood. No more complaints, no more sabotage, no more ridiculous legal threat. Just peace, quiet, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had played the game better than he ever could. Looking back, it was almost funny. A battle that had started over paint colors and noise complaints had escalated into a full-blown war of wills. But in the end, persistence had won. He had tried everything: manipulation, intimidation, even outright sabotage, but none of it had worked, because the truth was, he had never really been fighting for the neighborhood. He had been fighting for control, and once he realized he couldn't have it, he had nothing left. So as I sat on my porch, looking out at my perfectly renovated home, I couldn't help but smile. The house was mine. The victory was mine. And as for my neighbor? Well, wherever he was now, I could only hope that every house he passed reminded him of exactly what he had lost.